My brothers and sisters, let me ask you something no one dares to say aloud. What happens when Africa becomes the meeting ground of two of the world's oldest rivals? For decades, the West told us India and China could never sit at the same table. They fed the story of eternal hostility, of ancient borders that could never be crossed. But in the heart of Ouagadougou, that myth just collapsed. Picture the scene. Midnight. A phone in the Burkina Faso palace ringing on two lines at once, New Delhi on one, Beijing on the other, for 4 tense hours. Leaders who had spent years circling each other with suspicion listened in silence to a soldier from West Africa. Not a European envoy, not a Washington diplomat. A voice from Ouagadougou telling them, while you fight, the West profits. While you bleed each other, they chain us all. Then came the moment no one thought possible. Xi Jinping leaned forward. Narendra Modi nodded, and together they agreed. Africa will no longer be the chessboard, it will be the bridge. Days later, both men walked into the same room, not as adversaries, but as partners, to sign a $47 billion pact that left Washington stunned and Europe scrambling. This was not charity, not loans with hidden chains. This was something far more dangerous to the old order, cooperation without Western permission. Within hours, the Pentagon sounded the alarm. Within days, European leaders rushed to Asia, desperate to undo what had been done. But it was too late. The image of India and China shaking hands in Africa had already rewritten the map of power. So let me ask you, if Africa can unite two giants who spent 70 years divided, what else can it change? And if this bridge holds, what happens to the empire built on keeping us apart? Stay with me. Because what you are about to hear is not a story about trade. It is the story of how the world's balance of power may be shifting before your very eyes. Make sure you subscribe now, because the next chapters will shake you even harder. $47 billion signed in silence. Why is the West terrified? The world had grown used to seeing Africa as a prize to be won, not a player to be feared. But on that day in Ouagadougou, the script flipped. Ibrahim Traoré, the young captain-turned-president of Burkina Faso, hosted a gathering that Western capitals never believed could happen. On one side of the table sat Prime Minister Narendra Modi, representing India's billion-strong democracy. On the other, President Xi Jinping, leader of the world's second-largest economy. Between them, Africa, no longer begging, no longer divided, but leading. The moment did not appear out of thin air. It began with a midnight phone call. Traoré dialed both leaders simultaneously, forcing a three-way conversation no Western mediator had ever arranged. For 4 hours, he spoke not as a supplicant, but as a strategist. While you fight each other, he told them, the West dictates to all of us. Why should Africa remain poor while your rivalry makes America rich? The silence was heavy. Then Modi broke it with a question. What do you propose? Traoré's answer was simple. Stop fighting. Start building. Use Africa not as your battlefield, but as your collaboration ground. That seed grew into a framework worth $47 billion. The numbers alone sent shockwaves through global markets. $15 billion pledged by India for renewable energy across the Sahel. $18 billion from China for roads, railways, and ports. And $14 billion in joint industrial projects managed not separately, but together. For decades, New Delhi and Beijing had circled each other in suspicion. Now their money, technology, and manpower would meet on African soil, not to compete, but to cooperate. For Africa, this was unprecedented. Indian IT expertise would manage Chinese-built data centers. Chinese high-speed trains would run on Indian-designed digital ticketing systems. African universities would receive scholarships funded jointly by two Asian powers. Even the symbolism was powerful. Instead of begging for scraps at separate Western tables, Africa now sat at the head of a single shared feast. Western capitals understood instantly what had happened. Washington called emergency meetings with both India and China. The Pentagon leaked an internal memo warning that America's Indo-Pacific strategy had collapsed overnight. How could India act as a counterweight to China if the two were suddenly building railways together in West Africa? In Brussels, panic was no less intense. The European Commission rushed to announce a $30 billion Africa plan, but the timing only made Europe look desperate. Yet in Ouagadougou, the mood was calm. On state television, Traoré told his people, "We are not choosing sides. We are building a third option, partnership without domination." Across Burkina Faso, crowds celebrated in the streets. For once, the headlines were not about coups or crises. They were about a small, landlocked nation daring to reshape the world order. What made the West tremble most was not the money, but the principle. These projects were not loans with hidden conditions. They were not aid packages disguised as leverage. They were joint investments, structured so that Africa benefited as much as Asia. It was a direct assault on the philosophy of divide and rule that had kept continents apart for 70 years. And so the question hangs, if Africa can force rivals to shake hands, what else can it force the world to reconsider? If Ouagadougou can unite Delhi and Beijing, can Lagos unite Washington and Moscow? Can Africa become the stage where history rewrites itself? Stay with me, because the reactions that followed across America, across Europe, across Asia were louder than any trade numbers. They revealed just how fragile the old world order has become. When the West panicked, what were they really afraid of? The signing in Ouagadougou did not end with applause and handshakes. It triggered a storm across 3 continents. Within hours of the $47 billion agreement becoming public, phones rang in Washington, Brussels, and Paris. What terrified them was not only the size of the deal, it was the symbolism. Africa had just succeeded where decades of Western diplomacy had failed, bringing India and China to the same table. In Washington, Secretary of State Antony Blinken was rushed onto a plane to New Delhi. His message was blunt. This partnership threatens regional stability. But the subtext was clear. If India works with China instead of against it, America loses its most important card in Asia. The Pentagon circulated a classified memo that leaked within days. The Indo-Pacific strategy is no longer viable under current conditions. In simple terms, their plan to use India as a counterbalance to China had collapsed overnight. Meanwhile, in Beijing, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin arrived with a different tone. His warning was directed at China. Don't turn Africa into a platform for geopolitical competition. Yet the irony was impossible to miss. Competition was exactly what the West had encouraged for 70 years. Now that Africa was demanding cooperation, Washington called it dangerous. Europe panicked even more visibly. Ursula von der Leyen announced a $30 billion new Africa partnership, but observers saw it for what it was, a rushed attempt to keep Africa from slipping permanently into Asian hands. French President Emmanuel Macron flew to multiple African capitals, offering debt relief and military guarantees. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz proposed immediate trade concessions. But the desperation of these offers only highlighted what Europe had failed to provide for decades: respect and equality. African media captured the mood perfectly. One headline read, "They ignored us for 70 years, and now they fight for us in 70 hours." Crowds in Ouagadougou cheered as images of Modi and Xi shaking hands went viral. Across West Africa, young people debated whether their nations should push for similar trilateral deals. For once, the future did not look like dependency, it looked like leverage. But behind closed doors, the West's fear ran deeper than public statements suggested. This was not just about money, it was about control. If India and China could cooperate on African soil, then the dollar and euro could no longer be the only gateways for development. Trade could flow in rupees, yuan, and African currencies. Technology could transfer without Western patents or intermediaries. For Washington and Brussels, this was more dangerous than any military buildup. It was the slow death of financial dominance. In Burkina Faso, Traoré kept his words measured but firm. We are not pawns. We are partners. We will work with those who respect us, not those who exploit us. His calm tone contrasted sharply with the frenzy abroad. It was as if a young nation had discovered its voice, while the old empires struggled to understand the new language of power. And so, the question lingers. Was the West afraid of losing Africa's resources, or was it afraid of losing its centuries-old strategy of keeping others divided? If a landlocked nation like Burkina Faso can force rivals to cooperate, what will happen when larger African powers follow the same path? Stay with me, because the next wave of consequences, political, civil, and global, would shake Africa itself, and perhaps the very foundation of Western influence. When the people took to the streets, what does Africa really gain from this deal? If the event in Ouagadougou sent shockwaves through the West, it lit a flame of hope across Africa. In the capital of Burkina Faso, tens of thousands poured into the streets, not for a soccer match, but because, for the first time, they felt their nation was no longer just a pawn on the world's chessboard. On the walls, graffiti appeared. We do not choose sides. We choose the future. For the working class, that message was more than symbolism. Chinese-funded infrastructure projects broke ground, creating tens of thousands of new jobs. Indian renewable energy companies began hiring young engineers from Burkina Faso itself. For a country long branded as one of the poorest in the world, this was not just money. It was the possibility of ownership over its future. In classrooms, students whispered about scholarships funded jointly by India and China. They dreamed of studying software development in Bangalore, then returning home to manage data centers built by Chinese companies right on African soil. A new generation was growing up believing that knowledge no longer had to pass through Paris or Washington before reaching them. But the bigger shift came in politics. In the past, whenever an African nation accepted support from China, the West pressured it to choose Beijing's camp. Whenever it reached for India, it was pushed into the values competition game. Now Burkina Faso had proven a third path, multilateral cooperation, where Africa was not trapped between warring giants, but acting as the mediator itself. That example spread quickly. Nigeria announced negotiations for infrastructure projects involving both India and China. Kenya openly declared its ambition to become the manufacturing hub of the Asia-Africa corridor. Even in South Africa, leaders began discussing a new trade mechanism that could bypass the dollar altogether. A political wave was forming, built on one message: we do not need to choose sides. We must choose our own interests. Yet change also brought challenges at home. Opposition figures warned that these massive projects might simply create a new dependency, swapping Western dominance for Asian control. Civil society activists feared that without transparency, billions in funding could flow into elite pockets instead of reaching ordinary citizens. The skepticism was real, and it placed new responsibility on Burkina Faso's government to prove this time the benefits would flow to the people, not vanish into empty promises. At the continental level, the deal also rattled the African Union. Some countries welcomed it, seeing a golden chance to build collective strength. Others worried that an India-China-Africa axis might weaken their long-standing ties with Europe or the U.S. The split showed that while the bridge had been built, the road toward making cooperation a reality was still full of obstacles. And that is the paradox. While the West trembled at the thought of losing control, Africa itself had to face its toughest question: would this cooperation build a fair future or simply change the hand holding the whip? So the real question for us today is this: will this historic deal turn Burkina Faso into a symbol of independence or expose new cracks across the African continent? If Washington loses its favorite weapon, what comes next? The deal signed in Ouagadougou did not just change Africa. It struck at the heart of American strategy. For decades, Washington's playbook relied on one principle: keep potential rivals divided. India was cast as the democratic counterweight to China's authoritarian rise. The Indo-Pacific strategy, billions in military aid, and countless diplomatic missions, all hinged on one assumption: that Delhi and Beijing would never sit on the same side of the table. That illusion collapsed overnight. Suddenly, America's carefully crafted balance was gone. Pentagon officials admitted privately what few dared say in public: you cannot contain China with India if India is building railroads with China in Africa. The shock was not about Africa's resources alone. It was about the collapse of Washington's favorite tool: division. Financial markets felt the tremor next. For the first time, major projects in Africa were being priced not in dollars or euros, but in rupees, yuan, and African currencies. To Wall Street, this was a nightmare. A dollar-optional world meant U.S. sanctions would lose their bite, American banks would lose their leverage, and the financial dominance built since World War II would begin to erode. The true danger was not a military alliance, but an economic ecosystem beyond Washington's reach. Europe fared no better. Brussels scrambled to announce its own Africa plan, but the timing betrayed desperation. For years, Europe had taken Africa for granted, extracting resources while offering little in return. Now, seeing Delhi and Beijing work together on African soil, European leaders suddenly discovered the language of partnership. But Africans remembered too well the decades of neglect. "You ignored us for 70 years, one editorial wrote, "and now you fight for us in 70 hours. Elsewhere, the ripple effects spread. Moscow quietly welcomed the deal, seeing it as another crack in Western dominance. In Southeast Asia, countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia began exploring trilateral arrangements of their own, testing whether the model forged in Ouagadougou could be replicated beyond Africa. The idea was seductive. If rivals can cooperate when standing on African soil, perhaps old enmities elsewhere can also be rewritten. But in Washington, the mood darkened. Diplomats warned allies that Asian-African cooperation could undermine global stability. Yet the phrase was code for something simpler. American influence was shrinking. Without division, the U.S. could no longer dictate terms. Without rivalry, it could no longer pose as mediator. Without control of financial flows, its power to punish and pressure was fading. For the first time in decades, America faced a world where its dominance was not assumed, but contested. And the question haunting Washington's corridors was chilling in its simplicity. If we cannot divide, how do we rule? And that is where the story turns. Because the next moves, by Washington, by Europe, by Asia, will determine not just Africa's future, but the shape of global power itself. So ask yourself, if the old empire's favorite weapon has been broken, what new weapon will it try to build? And will the world allow it? Can this fragile bridge survive the storms ahead? The framework signed in Ouagadougou is still young, its promises still fragile. The numbers look impressive, billions in infrastructure, technology, and energy, but the true test has only just begun. Can Africa hold two ancient rivals together long enough to turn promises into reality? In the short term, the road ahead looks promising. Construction cranes are rising across West Africa. Scholarships are being processed. Investment offices in Ouagadougou buzz with activity. For ordinary Africans, these changes feel real. Jobs, training, and new opportunities are finally within reach. But the real storm may come from outside. Washington and Brussels will not sit idle while their influence shrinks. Already, intelligence reports suggest Western powers are preparing countermeasures, aggressive sanctions, propaganda campaigns, even covert operations to sow mistrust between India and China. The same strategy that worked for decades, divide and rule, will not vanish quietly. There are also challenges from within. Can Burkina Faso and its partners ensure transparency so that the billions do not vanish into elite pockets? Can rival political factions resist the temptation to weaponize foreign partnerships for domestic power? Can young Africans keep faith in the vision when progress moves slower than headlines? If this fragile bridge holds, the future could be revolutionary. Imagine African resources processed